Everything going. So I'd like to call the Wednesday, January 7th board meeting for the Ramsey-Washington Metro Watershed District to order. For starters, well, I'm going to ask, can we approve, do we have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved. Second.
Okay, discussion. Nothing.
We do have something we want to remove, right?
Yeah, that's what I was good though.
Yeah, so we'll do that here.
Yeah, we'll do it before we approve it. That's
So
what
that
I
you
was
can
hoping
do
for.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, I'd like to pull the Snail Lake boat launch from the permit program.
And so we'll move it from D down to A. We'll do A, we'll call it first A1. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so then I'll redo the approval for the agenda then? Or
Yeah.
can I have a motion to approve the agenda with the change of moving D1 to 5A?
Second.
Awesome. So we're to the consent agenda.
Well, and you have to vote on the agenda.
Oh, yes. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Thank you for the reminder, Tina.
Mhm.
And moving on to consent agenda, can I have, do I have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
I will move that we approve it. Is that with the recognized change? Do we have to acknowledge that?
This is the consent agenda.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we've already pulled it
We've
off.
already pulled it, so you can-
Yeah, it would be without.
I'll second.
Okay, discussion. I do have a couple of questions, just really quick. One of them was on the Snail Lake boat launch.
Well, that got moved now, so we can talk.
Oh,
about
yeah,
that
we'll
now.
talk, thank you, Tina. The other one was on, this is what I get for not compiling my notes. Oh, there was one where it was a permit where the treatment was off-site.
Mm-hmm. The MnDOT project?
Yes, could you help me just understand that a little better? I haven't seen one of those before.
Yeah, so our permanent stormwater treatment rule it's Rule C. It has what's called alternative compliance sequencing that allows permittees to step through if they're triggering permanent treatment to step through. First they must infiltrate on site unless they can demonstrate that it's infeasible. And then they move to filtration on site. And if they can demonstrate that that's not feasible either, then they go off-site within the district, or they can utilize banked credits, from previous projects where they may be provided extra treatment.
Okay.
So it's a step through that alternative compliance sequencing, and you're right, it doesn't happen a lot. It mostly happens with public agencies like that have lots of land kind of spread throughout the district. A lot of one-off private development, they almost have to skip through that because they don't have any other land to look for that. But yeah, so MnDOT is proposing to meet and actually exceed the storage requirements, but you're right, it's north of the project area.
And when we consider those, do we consider the local because they're making the change on Highway 5.
Right.
Do we consider the local ramifications in this area?
We certainly, for the on-site corridor, we were looking at rate control to make sure that, yes, you're not providing treatment on-site, but we want to make sure there's not any adverse impacts because of that. So they did have to demonstrate that they're meeting rate control on-site. And then the treatment is, the water quality treatment is for a net benefit to the area to the north.
Yeah, and that was the root of my question, was more on the treatment side.
Yeah.
Do we have sufficient in the surround area to make sure that it is treated, that we don't have big issue? But if we're treating elsewhere, we're thinking on the whole, it's okay. Is that a fair way of summarizing it?
Yeah, I mean, on-site is always preferred, but due to some contamination, some actually identified threatened species habitat along the corridor, and just right-of-way constraints, they opted to go off-site with their treatment.
It's just the first permit I've seen that way, so I apologize
Yeah,
for the
it's
question.
not common, for sure.
I have no further discussion.
Do we have time for a follow-up question?
Yeah.
Kind of clarification.
For sure.
For those entities that would propose kind of the offsite and the banking concept, how do they kind of initiate? How do so cities
Yeah.
or a state agency, a MnDOT, or you
Yeah.
know, they have probably the wherewithal, but do we have some criteria that they really need to meet if they don't have any existing credits, if they haven't done a project for a while? Can you speak to that just briefly?
Yeah, so as part of the stormwater management plan and the permit submittal, there's a usually pretty lengthy narrative that goes through, you know, all addressing all of the applicable rules for the permit. So that doesn't get included in board packets. They're generally very long, big, large documents. But for like, for instance, offsite BMP locations, if an applicant was saying, you know, we don't have any offsite locations to provide treatment, we would follow up with, where did you look and why? Like, why is it infeasible in this situation? And why is it infeasible in this location? For this, they were basically going through, these are the reasons and the locations on the corridor that we can't provide treatment and why. So certainly if they just said, yep, we're gonna provide offsite treatment, there would be additional discussion and information needed. It's not just like a take your word for it.
And don't they have to first try to do it on site and then within the same sub watershed if possible, and then within our watershed?
Yeah.
And then sometimes it happens outside of our watershed district, which just irks me to no end.
Well, that's, yeah, for wetlands replacement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they can acquire those, if I can use the word credits.
Yep.
From other entities that may have them.
They can, it's not very common because they're very coveted. They're tracked by cubic feet of storage. So we have a spreadsheet that tracks excess credit provided on like, say, a previous MnDOT project. And so that's, you know, has been tracked through most of the history of our volume reduction rules, 20 years or so. So, yeah, for this, we're looking at where did MnDOT provide extra treatment in the past?
And we
Or I
are,
guess that's not
and we are
applicable.
exclusively the keeper and gatekeeper of that accounting.
I mean, permittees, they are
Like-
tracking, yeah, they're free to track their required versus provided volumes and compare that with our records. A lot of times they don't, they just ask for our records and we keep the stormwater reports on file to show what was required as far as volume and what was provided, and therefore what was the excess or the deficit.
Thank you.
That comes in later to this Maplewood permit too, because they are using bank credits for that one.
Right. Thank you.
So now we need to vote, and we have all in favor of the approving the consent agenda, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, now on to visitor comments. Do we have anyone who wants to make comment?
Both permits, both of them are for permittees. Yeah, are you here for the heights?
Yes, I'm Bob Ball, the creator for the Heights.
It is. And Catherine.
Yeah.
Catherine is us.
Yeah,
So we're-
Catherine Sarnicki from the St. Paul Port Authority. Here to, if there's any questions on the Heights project.
There's no other. pictures.
Perfect.
Oh, John. Hi, John. Do you want to introduce yourself too? Thank you.
Hi, John Chikala, currently serving on the CAC. Just want to see, first of all, that Mark Gurnes behaves tonight.
I know you'll keep an eye on me, John. Thank you.
Anyway, just want to attend the board meeting. Thank you.
John.
Awesome. So let's transition to the permit program and the consent agenda removed permit program Snail Lake boat launch in Shoreview.
Can I assume this is removed because,
Yeah.
I was in charge of design and development of construction documents as well as submitting permit, so.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm not
So
gonna.
then I'll be abstaining.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And so in this case, we should probably do a roll call because he is abstaining.
Yeah, I think that would be less.
So yeah, I can step through this. It is a boat launch replacement project and partial parking lot replacement at Snail Lake, southeast corner of Snail Lake and Shoreview. Because of the small disturbance area, there's no permanent stormwater treatment required that's triggered at an acre of disturbance. So that is not applicable. But the county Parks Department did have to provide cut and fill volumes within the floodplain to make sure that there's not any net fill or loss of storage. Any other questions?
I only have one just clarifying comment on the diagram that was sent out. Maybe this is one of those that I'm just misreading it, where we have the manage A next to Snell Lake.
Yeah.
There was part of the permit that's within that manage A. Is that the dock? Or what is that little offshoots?
Yeah, so the polygons that are part of permit maps and our GIS inventory are not based on actual site delineations. So they should be taken with a grain of salt. But there was a wetland delineated fringe on the east of the project.
Okay.
And so they've marked that off and staked it, and they don't anticipate to be going into that fringe at all. But right off the sort of existing dock,
Yeah.
it's just like.
Yeah, I was just, when I looked at it and then it just didn't align with no
Yeah.
disturbance because of how it's drawn, and that's what I was
sure,
not
yeah.
sure of.
Yeah, a little misleading.
Okay, so I don't have any other further questions. Do we have a motion to approve permit project number 2313?
So moved. Second.
Okay, a discussion, any further discussions? So let's go ahead and do a roll call vote for this permit.
Pam?
Aye.
Ted?
Abstain.
Mark?
Aye.
Matt?
Aye.
And Bill.
Okay. Permit application 2315.
Yeah, this is a Maplewood roadway reconstruction near Larpenter and McKnight. A couple areas that are being proposed for partial, full reconstruction, partial pavement rehabilitation. They're proposing a 3-celled infiltration basin in Hillside Park, where there's also a wetland that's been delineated. In order to outlet that basin, there needs to be a pipe to the wetland. So they're proposing a wetland variance for that third end and riprap, and then temporary disturbance due to site grading. So there is a wetland variance request with this application. They similarly had to submit cut and fill volumes for that riprap and flared end because it's in the floodplain of the wetland. So they're demonstrating that there's no net fill.
I did have a question on this one. Maplewood actually has stricter wetland buffers and setback requirements than does the watershed. I know that we can't control that, but and I also understand that Maplewood can give exemptions for that. Is that something we can ask for proof of as a part of their permit? That exemption?
For their own rules?
Yeah.
I have
have-
asked this question. I'm unclear if their roadway projects are exempt from their own buffer. I haven't gotten a clear answer, but we could certainly request clarification on that. We can't withhold a permit based on them meeting another permit's requirements in that way, but I have also been confused by that in the past, and why or why not it wouldn't require a variance from their own rules.
Yeah, my understanding from reading the municipal code is that they can get the exemption, but they do need to do some type of public engagement, which involves mailings and have a
Sure.
coming through their community design board.
Mhm.
I guess some clarification or just a letter from the city council saying, yes, we've given this exemption.
Yeah,
I guess that would help my understanding because I mean, their wetland fee manage is like 75 feet, 50-foot average buffer.
yeah, or it's twice ours.
Yeah, I mean, I've got it.
Minimum.
It's 50 foot with a 75 average.
Okay.
So I guess that was my question. It wasn't explained in the narrative, so some clarification.
we can't, like she said, we wouldn't be able to withhold our
Yeah.
permit basis, but it does, I think, say in our permit. When we issue the permit that they have to have a
Yeah.
applicable
Yeah,
Yeah, but we, yeah,
permit required.
basically on them to.
Yeah.
to do that, unless it's like a wetland permit, because we administer
Mhm.
that, but yeah, I can certainly request clarification on that. Cause I have a question, so.
I have a couple questions as well. Has there been any discussion regarding that proposed outfall with the riprap, which is going to occur in the wetland? They provide some explanation, justification about that. They don't have much room for moving it up.
Yeah, they've already moved it up to minimize the
Yeah.
impacts, because
I-
it was further in already.
Is that their only option for an outfall type design with riprap? Because I don't know exactly what the flows they anticipate, but.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like it is an area that would be very prone to erosion in terms of, high flows. And I'm just curious if there's been any discussion with them, any engagement on the
Yeah.
design of that riprap.
I'd say that we prefer energy dissipation of some sort at the pipe outlet, because erosion to me is worse than the
But won't-
riprap impact itself.
Won't their 3-cell system provide some energy dissipation itself?
Yeah, but it's only designed to capture 1.1 inches. And it has a certain drawdown rate, so it's gonna outlet during rain events.
Like overflow, right?
Yeah.
Sure.
And we wouldn't wanna see it not have an outlet. We wouldn't wanna see it not have energy dissipation. Which is,
Yeah, we have
Maybe
to require
there's-
the energy dissipation.
yeah, and maybe there's other proprietary.
Yeah, so my second line of question is in relation to that energy dissipation, and I don't know, this may not be the best forum, but I'm familiar with that basin. I don't live far away. I have walked through that park. And that basin, I have thought for many years, sure, it's full of sediment. I have no idea what its history. I've not really inquired that. And I don't know if it's the city's primary responsibility for maintenance of that basin, or if the district has some responsibility. I think it's probably the municipality.
I assume so, if they're.
Yeah, and so it would seem if they're proposing to, maybe not route additional waters, but they certainly are changing the way that those waters are being conveyed, that this would be an opportunity to have that, I guess, discussion. And now that there's a permit before it, plus it's probably not.
You talking about a clean out at the?
Yeah, I mean, because, that basin is just, it's very sedimented in. It's full of. There's a little bit of fragments, but lots of cattails, and it just has the appearance, again, I don't know its history, but it sure had the appearance that it had been more of an open water marsh, and I've walked through it, and it's pretty flat.
Yeah, we can pass that along to the city as a recommendation for, we've done some pond cleanouts as part of our CIP maintenance project for the city. They only do a few a year, so
Sure.
of all the ponds in the city. I'm not sure where this one ranks in priority, but we can pass that along.
Probably not a high ranking in terms of volume
Yeah.
control, and it's not one that has been probably actively managed. I know a concern in at least the last decade or two, but it's been there, I think, for a very long time. And it has certainly a history that seems to have been north.
Yeah, there's a delta right in that corner. There's not an inlet there now, so I'm hesitant to say that that would be the cleanup spot that they would target, but yeah, I agree, if they're already digging around in there and it happened to
I'm
be,
not even sure.
Accessible?
how it is-
yeah,
is operable.
sure, okay.
Are you thinking the structure that they're putting in place might not function the way you anticipated to function? Is that?
Well, they're putting in the 3-star, excuse me.
They did have to submit modeling for the wetlands. And so they are assuming, I would guess, with a survey that is operable.
So I guess the thinking, not to belabor this, but this basin, I would judge, is already overloaded with sediment. It has had no maintenance for at least the last 30 years. And yet we have a concern about potential erosion and material sediment moving in, thus the riprap. They have some concern about rate, thus the 3-cell kind of stepped system. And it just seems like, gee, if we're trying to do those things, shouldn't we also pay attention to sort of that back end? And I'm honestly not sure, and I am familiar with the basin. I don't know where the outlet should be. There's no evidence, but I think it's still there. And I've never seen that thing over top with volume, water volume.
Who would be responsible for maintenance of this particular structure?
City of Maplewood, yeah.
Yeah.
So we can pass that along to them. I'm sure, like Nicole said, they would have had to have surveyed it. And survey the condition. Maybe they have planned maintenance during this project that's not included in the.
Yeah, but if they did the
We can
maintenance, it'd be
double check.
altering to a wetland body, right? So
It'd be what?
wouldn't it be altering that wetland area?
Yeah, but they'd be allowed to.
Yeah, you could get a
other
accumulator.
sediments.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can't remember that line.
Yeah, and hopefully, I would think the infiltration basin would help that problem in the future, because as far as I know, the wetland is currently untreated.
Yeah.
So it's taking drainage from the street, or it will take drainage from the street and, pre-treat that as well via sumps to catch
Should
that.
be better.
We'll follow up on that.
Yeah.
Make sure that it's all.
In building this type of structure in this wetland, there aren't rules or anything that govern building in this wetland area?
Yep, they had to get a wetland conservation act permit and boundary approved. The Wetland Conservation Act allows for small impacts without replacement for things like this. Which is why they quantified down to the square foot what their impacts are. And why they did pull it back, because it was an outlet further into the wetland, which would have been more impacts, so.
Okay. Did we make a motion for this? Yes. Do I have a motion to approve 2315?
I will motion to approve this permit.
Okay. Okay, any further discussion? Okay,
I guess I just had a question. So we wouldn't hear about any exemptions or any of these questions till after the permit's passed?
The city ordinance?
Yeah.
Well, oh, actually, I don't have any remaining special provisions. So yeah, we would issue the permit, and under the general provisions of the permit, it says all other applicable rules. I forgot the languages, but yeah, at that point, I would ask them, because again, their interpretation of their own rules wouldn't necessarily hold up our permit review and approval process.
Yeah, and it's not something we would normally bring back to the board, but if you wanted to, separately.
I was just curious how this motion is
Yeah.
working, so.
well, and they can't alter the plans because they've been reviewed, or they trigger another review permit wise
Yeah.
for us, right?
And that does happen sometimes, yeah.
So
Yeah,
that-
so if they changed it, it would
Yeah.
come back to us at least. And if it's minor, we don't typically bring it back to you. If it's more major and it's like a new variance or something like that, then you would see it again.
Could you help me understand, Ben, what concern you're going after? Is there,
They are just more restrictive on, so instead of only having our 25-foot average, they actually bumped that up to a 50-foot average on
Yeah, yeah.
wetland B, so they're essentially doing more to protect these wetlands, and I'm just wondering, you know, in an open area like that, how they can't establish a better buffer when it's in their own rules to do so.
Mhm.
So I'm just questioning, you know, that aspect.
Have they done everything that they needed to do?
I'm sure they have. My question is just like, did they provide that exemption letter, and with reasoning, it'd be nice to see why that was. So I don't have a question about passing this, I just had a clarifying question about how it was passed at that point.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah, it actually helped me ask the question again.
Yeah.
Like, oh, this came up at our meeting.
Okay, well, then all in favor of the motion for approving 2315, say aye.
Aye.
Yeah, let's transition to 2317, the Heights.
Yeah, some of the board members originally got a preview of this project way back in 2020, and then in April of this year, an update on the wetland permitting. So here you're seeing for your consideration, phase 1 of the Heights redevelopment, future multi-use development with residential, commercial, light industrial, and green space and parkland. I think as I mentioned in April, there is has been a lot of soil investigation done on the site, and they've observed or found pretty widespread mercury contamination, I think mostly due to past land use. So any redevelopment of the site is going to require some pretty large scale soil remediation. And that would be regulated by the MPCA and the Department of Agriculture. So for phase 1, they're proposing the demolition of the existing golf course building and parking lot and any impervious trails that exist. So removing all that and then beginning their soil remediation and grading. So what I also wanted to point out is what this does not include is any impervious area or permanent treatment, as those plans are not developed enough for us to review in detail. I do anticipate you'd be seeing it fairly soon. I'm not entirely sure, but I know that we wanted to phase this out so that I anticipate the soil remediation will be a long process. And I know the port hopes to start that this summer. So in addition to that remediation, there are a number of wetlands on site proposed to be impacted to remove contaminated sediment. And as I mentioned in April, the applicant is proposing to replace impacts of wetlands at a 1-to-1 ratio on site. The state, through the Wetland Conservation Act, will require overall 2-to-1 replacement. And so they're proposing that remaining 1-to-1 to be purchased off-site bank credits. They are doing the on-site mitigation primarily to meet our board's no net loss of wetlands policy. And they are fulfilling that by what they're proposing. They're also wanting, for future planning purposes, to establish their wetland buffer widths. And there is a variance included for both the contaminated sediment removal and for the final proposed buffers. So I certainly can entertain questions and step through more of the variants if preferred. I will say the City of St. Paul, again, is the local government unit responsible for Wetland Conservation Act permitting. They opt to do that themselves within the City of St. Paul. So they did approve a wetland replacement plan through the state in May.
We're going from 10 to 2. Is that what I'm understanding? 10 wetlands on site to 2.
No, there will be
I was trying to make sense of the picture.
5.
5.
It's kind of easy when you look at the table they provided.
I looked at the table, but I couldn't rectify where they went all in the
So
picture.
3 of the wetlands are proposed to remain or partially remain, and then 2 constructed or mitigation areas.
This one's just so sad.
I'm so sorry. Nicole, I just don't know where they are. So the ones that are asking variance are on
The constructed wetlands,
the outlet A and B. Is that correct? When I look at the schematic,
What page are you on?
forgive me, page 80.
80?
Yeah.
so if you step further down the variance request, they have a table of wetland IDs. So the mitigation D and H are the constructed mitigation areas. And then if you move through the plans some more, it'll show those. And I'm sorry, what is your question?
Like I said, oh, this didn't.
I can share.
Okay, it is. So it is, I was going off of the graphic.
Yeah, that was that's existing conditions, that first graphic I think that you're looking at,
Okay,
page 80 or thereabouts. And then,
I think 85 kind of walks through
yeah,
well in detail in terms of giving their names, their locations. Scenario.
So they're asking to have the buffers reduced now and we're approving that now? Is that, or right now, are we just approving that they're gonna knock down some buildings?
the wetland buffer variance is part of this approval or request for approval. If you look at the table, they're exceeding wetland buffer widths for the existing wetlands that are proposed to remain. And they are not exceeding or not meeting buffer widths for mitigation wetlands D and H
And those are management class A, right, the best?
correct.
Yeah,
because they're
Because they're new.
mitigation. Because they'll be new constructed.
Oh, wait,
So all
you
new-
can't make a new class A wetland, can you?
I think they defaulted to class
Any
A.
mitigated wetlands, I say, because we want it to be maintained, we're
Oh,
creating.
that's where I'm confused. Okay, so it's not, all right, I was.
It doesn't
that's
have
what
an
I was-
existing classification under our normal.
But the existing
Inventory.
basins for both H and D, their classification,
For managed
It's
C,
B.
B.
wetland C is.
It's just a little confusing.
One of the,
Yeah, on page 81, really lays it out. I just,
So mitigation area D, for instance, they're proposing average 20 foot less. And then as far as minimum, 9.5 feet variance for the minimum buffer.
the table on page 8, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So that table, wetland H, it says managed 2, which is a B, correct? But then it has C in parentheses.
It says 2.
let's see.
It's a
I thought it was a B, but they're trying to make it C. I'm confused by that.
That one is a C too, I
Yeah.
believe, yeah.
Because the watershed requirements are listed are C.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, I don't know why it says-
yeah, but what is it? What do we recognize that classification as? For certain
B.
C
Mhm.
in our system.
That one's right next to the road.
Yeah, that's on the south.
Yeah,
east.
it's on on the permit location map.
Way back at the delineation.
So the extra buffer they're putting in comes out to be more than the amount they're not putting in.
For the wetlands that are natural,
Mhm.
that's correct.
Okay.
And the constructed ones, the mitigation wetland H, they're asking for a 4.5 foot variance for minimum buffer width and about 20 foot average. I think I always like,
H, while it's constructed, is also existing.
yeah, it's
So
being
it's not-
expanded.
Yeah, so it's
So
not
that's
just
part
a
of
new
H.
wetland.
Yeah,
It's also existing.
And what
And
kind,
what's the existing classification for age?
C.
So that was part of my question too, is if they're just expanding that one or adding it close to it, does it make them both C or just one? That's where I get really kind of
Yeah,
confused while I was trying to dig
when
into
we
where
said,
they
like,
actually are.
If it's new, we consider A, but existing is C.
Yeah, we go to the more restrictive classification.
So it'd be A. And
Right, and then it's expanded.
You can go back to page 78.
actually, that makes me have less of a problem with it now that I think about it that way. Because if it's a C, they've clearly met that, you know, I mean, if the existing wetland is a C, they've met that buffer.
but the existing, the
Illustration.
The map, this one,
Yes. So I see in the center, I believe those two basins are well in D. And
One of them is D, that one right in the middle is.
one is G.
So again, that's not reflecting the delineation that was done. That was just what we had in our
I
inventory.
guess where I was going is H is in the southeast corner, and that's not show, you don't show it.
right, because it was delineated, it wasn't on our mapping.
This permitting happened back in 2020. The delineation, or 2021. And the management.
Page 85
class.
is the map you're looking for.
So when we did the management class in the early 90s, early to mid 90s, we met that well and we wasn't there.
Or it was
Were these
thought to
done-
be constructed.
Yeah,
was your mapping done by aerial imagery?
Yeah.
Because then it's very easy to miss, you
Yeah.
know, a marshy wetland.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
ground truth, but
Yeah.
it's possible and or likely that our staff thought
It's
it
here in McKnight and it's fairly large paper, but it doesn't show on the map. It's missing somewhere.
yeah, what I'm trying to say is I think that it was originally thought to be a constructed pond for the golf course, and then through the delineation permitting, we found it to be historical. So even the golf course and the Port Authority and WSB thought that they're not regulated wetlands until that permitting process back in, I believe it was 2020. So I'm assuming that we made that same judgment call
Okay.
at that time, and that's why it's not in our,
That's why we
inventory.
require delineations.
Yeah, they should never be relied on exclusively, our mapping.
on those mitigation wetlands that are being created, are they at the end? I know per policy they're A, are they at the end going to be manage A?
Yeah.
They will be?
Yes,
Well, the variance is like less than that.
well, the classification will still.
But the
be
classification is-
Yeah,
Well, I guess what I'm trying to understand is what for the minimum required, how much impact would it be just to, so what's important? Do you hit the minimum or the average around? That's where I struggle. It feels like the minimum seems like it's pretty important to hit around the base, around the watershed or wetland. And then what prevents us from trying to hit at least the minimum?
That's for you guys to decide here tonight.
right, so that's the variance request that they're asking for.
Yeah.
It's
And there's-
specifically the minimum one, like, or
Both.
both. Yeah, it would be
Yeah.
both. You're totally right.
And they give reasoning for each part of the request, so we can narrow in on that if you'd
Well,
like.
when I read it, it's the reason is for job creation, and I'm very much for job creation, but 4 feet, how many jobs does that prevent from being created?
How much habitat did that get destroyed?
So on page 2 of the variance request, it gets into more detail about their design. And so, like, if you're looking at, you have a specific one that you're looking at.
Well, if you're looking at like wetland H, for example,
Mhm.
they hit all of the minimums except
One
on the
area.
side of the
With the road.
road where you're constricted.
Yeah.
And you can't hit the minimum.
Which is where coastal runoff is gonna go that direction.
Yeah, McKnight is existing. And then the
You want it-
proposed Arlington Avenue, which I think is on the map. They want it to align with the existing Arlington east of McKnight.
So how about with regard to, okay, so we saw on the table the amount of feet and how that is, but with regard to area, if that one wetland is 17 times the size of the other ones, then it is a big loss. But if it's a tiny one relative to the other one, you know what I'm asking? Did that make sense?
I think what you're asking is like the area.
The area of the buffer. Yeah, well, like, so if, so we're presented this table with numbers of feet.
Mhm.
But if the number, and we're saying that, oh, this wetland here, we're gonna go excess by 50 feet. But this one down here, we're gonna be shy by 9 to 25 feet. And if the one down here is 25 times the size as the one up here, then that makes that's a huge
I was
loss.
thinking a
But-
no net loss of buffer.
But yeah, so I'm asking about the area, I guess, of the ponds, and I'm looking at these pictures here, and I guess I just don't really know. Are the ponds all about the same size? That would be, that'd be an easy way to answer that question.
I think the table on, what is this? This page, it actually shows you like the wetland area impact and the fill or net gain
Thank you.
or loss. That one helps me kind of wrap my head around it. A little
Or
better.
here visually, maybe.
Yeah, and I guess it'd be nice to see in this table like total.
These drawings help too, right? This is the other way to look at it, Pam.
Yep.
Yeah.
There's some drawings on there. that-
So it's much bigger.
Well, so on one side with the, for D, if we start with D, it's larger toward the parcel, toward the industrial areas, it looks. But it's shorter to the road.
Right, I think that's what maybe Nicole is getting at a little bit, like each of these wetlands is unique, right?
Yeah.
Like, for instance, this one has a road right next to it. And so to average out a buffer around the whole thing.
It'd be very
impossible,
difficult,
right?
right?
Or, well, it's impossible to have a buffer when you have the road there.
So when we're right next to the road with the wetland C, and that one, they're not really changing, that's been, well, is that's one that exists, right? They're not really
Yeah.
changing. So that one I don't really have many questions on. It's the, yeah, the newly created ones on the mitigation areas. These are the ones that I'm kind of curious about, if it could just move slightly more. I mean, this one, I think it's 10 foot to get away from the road for, in terms of meeting the minimum.
To the west.
Correct. Well, in this instance, to the left, but yeah. Because the minimum at that 32 feet, isn't that this? No, it's 28. It's on that side. Sorry, it's at the bottom. That's the smallest point that's invalidating the minimum, right? And so when I'm thinking about the buffer is to protect the wetland. And the mount average is just generally it, but the minimum is kind of what that makes me scratch my head on. Is why can't we move that one around a bit more?
Yeah, on the west, that number that, if you blow it up, that's 26 feet.
Oh, it is, I'm sorry, it's hard to see. Oh, I could just look on my.
Right here, 28,
I
Yeah,
think
the
26.
this one?
No, I'm going.
Oh, do you see another one?
On the white. The white basin existing.
Yeah, that's managed C.
This one meets.
Yeah, that one meets, because that's managed C.
Yeah,
And
there's-
so
there's-
And the wetland D is an A. And they have 46 feet up top. So if you moved it, so what they try to do is keep the minimum at the top and didn't meet it at the bottom. Is effectively what I'm seeing. We're just trying to figure out how to protect the wetlands, and I thought the minimum would do more to that. That and grading would help protect the wetland.
Do you know much about, this 28-foot setback from the, looks like a proposed bituminous path or constraint? I think they're narrowing it.
Prevents us from meeting the minimum around the wetland D new water.
So you move it to the northwest, wouldn't you pinch the 75 that we're doing up there? I mean, we can move that around, but I mean, we're trading, are we trading one buffer for another?
Well, I'm
We
just
could
trying to
back it up
understand,
on our-
can we manage to make a minimum at least versus an average?
And the minimum is 35,
20, it's 37.5.
37 and a half, which, I'm sorry, I can't see what's on the screen.
28, right, at this pinch point on this.
Come learn with us.
I guess what's on the other side of this bituminous path then? Will this be developed or is this,
Yeah, that would be,
oh, that's developed, okay.
is that Arlington? Is that one? That's,
There's a property line there. I don't recognize.
oh, that's, okay, yeah, that's the Excel site entrance.
Because when I read the exception and everything else, the last sentence is what's making me stressed out. So when I read the last sentence, it effectively says, hey, there could be other asks for buffer and changes with walkways, et cetera. And so it leaves it open for us not meeting any of the buffer today for these new ones to potentially cause harm to them in the future with future permits as you build.
One thing that's not accounted for here is that we, along the boulevard, we do have a 25-foot landscape buffer. It's not included here. As well, where it appears a 25-foot district stormwater buffer. All those will be planted in natural vegetation. So in those areas too, we get that extra 25 feet. So if that's an argument in favor of
So around
the
this,
justification for the.
They'll be
minimum.
planted with native or natural? What are you, with native vegetation?
Well, I mean, we don't know our amenity spaces. We haven't done a lot of the planting plans, but there's
They're all
gonna be
gonna be native, Bob.
okay.
Our landscapers, we have to use all native species to meet the community requests.
Yeah, there'll be hardscape too and other amenity
So it won't
spaces.
be a continuous buffer space.
You know, I'm concerned too. You're saying that later they can come back and say, we want to amend these buffers again.
what I read
And
was development of the final design of the heights continues and subsequent variance requests may be submitted at a later phase for green area amenities such as nature players, boardwalks, natural pathways to allow access. So the pathways and the boardwalks, when I start thinking about where they might end up, could just continue to eat into the buffer. And so we're just going to see that over and over again. This is kind of my fear.
You would be, you have to prove that.
I don't totally get it. So I'm just trying to, so we're starting at like,
I know they want the public to be able to interact with these wetland areas, but they weren't far enough along in design that I said, don't include that in this variance, but be transparent that when you get further through design, there might be more asks, at which point the board would have to approve that at that time.
so in my head, we're starting at a point of like, we already have a variance request and then there could be additional variance requests on it for some reason that doesn't sit well with me. That's I apologize. That's my problem with the permit.
oh, I have that same concern.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
Can we step back just a, so the variance itself is for construction activity related primarily to the brownfield mitigation. So isn't the variance, isn't the intent that they are gonna have to excavate at least up to or maybe into some of these basins following mitigation, that activity? They will then bring forth something like this as the buffer. Is that the way this?
Are you asking sequencing why
Yeah.
why this buffer is
So-
brought to the board?
So I
Yeah.
guess the next kind of detail is that why they're being a little bit hesitant to provide kind of final detail, because they really don't know what all the fine level grading and so forth is gonna really be until after you get through the mitigation.
If I could answer that, no, these are the final grading plans for the wetlands. as well.
Yeah,
The only thing that we would be doing in wetland buffer areas in the future is potentially building amenity spaces within them, moved by the watershed, so people can interact with the wetland areas. So there might be boardwalks, elevated boardwalks, other sorts of things. Again, they'd all be submitted with the watershed, but the intent is here and with WACA, we have to establish these wetlands in our mass grading project. We have to get that, table set essentially, so that the developments can come in. But this needs to be established, it's seeded, it needs the hydrology, so all of that needs to be in place before development occurs.
So then it is fair question though about the fact that they could come forward and ask for more.
But if I may, that's true on any project.
Yep.
That's true on any project. And I feel like on this one, and I understand that you can have hesitancy. Pam, you mentioned, I'm on the exact opposite side, which is the the fact that the entity, the Port Authority, is transparent enough to say, here's our locked in grading plan. But at some point in the future, depending on community interest, we may put in a path, we may put in a boardwalk. They could have skipped that sentence and we would have voted. And then a year from now, we'd be sitting here with, oh, we have a variance. I give any developer credit that at least they expose, we don't know. So we're going to do our best, but something may change. And I keep coming back to every permit we approve is subject to a future variance request. We may or may not choose to approve it.
This
But
one's
this is hardly-
this one's like guaranteed for another phase.
Well, almost certainly. It's a
Yeah.
giant project.
Well, and we don't have to approve it when it comes.
But I think the future variance would be for some type of educational aspect, some type of thing to really get people involved and see this. So I could see those being easier to swallow in the future than maybe what you're thinking. And now that I'm hearing kind of the future proposed amenities, some of these setbacks and why they didn't maybe join these two wetlands are starting to make more sense to me. So that explanation.
And Ben, thank you, because I didn't want to, I'll be very transparent. I'm totally comfortable with this. And I don't see a future variance coming in of proposing an oil refinery.
Yeah.
It's going to be an environmental amenity that actually meets our criteria.
Help me understand why we can't, so the buffer protects the wetland, that's the goal of the buffer. And we're talking 4 feet. For one of them. Why can't they meet minimum buffer of 4 feet? That's less than a parking spot.
I mean, honestly, I don't think any of us can answer that. We'd have to ask the Port Authority.
Right, well, exactly.
So that's why that,
Don't we
that's
have-
what I asked.
Can we ask?
Either Bob or Catherine can respond to that.
Yeah, I can jump in, and Bob, please correct me if I'm wrong. Between the existing wetland and the mitigated wetland, between those two buffers, there's a very small space in between those two buffers. And the thought was we want to leave space to let people get into that area and create sort of a hill and a lookout and some spaces for people to go. If you guys would rather shift that wetland a little bit and close that gap, knowing that then likely we would come back for some sort of path or access in between those, whether that's in a boardwalk phase or some sort of protected phase or whatever. You know, I think we were trying to allow for amenity spaces with what we could. But I think, you know, if we need to shift the space from that bituminous path or look at, certainly we're willing to look at alternate materials other than bituminous path for a bike path of, you know, porous pavement or some other path type, we could look at those things as well.
I get where you're going.
Overall buffer area wouldn't change, of course, because we're bounded by our square and everything within that square is buffer.
But to the left of the buffer, I mean, I don't know, there's where there's not a road, there's space, and if you went out that way more, for example, I don't know. So you can't do that because that's where you plan to put a building or something?
Well, it's slow, right next to the trail, the north of the trail is slope that we would consider eligible for buffer. It's a steeper slope.
Why wouldn't a slopey buffer? I wouldn't think a slope would be fine buffer.
WACA has some slope requirements.
Oh.
So we took
We
that out.
don't, our rules don't. Yeah.
We've had to approve several variances, and this isn't at all against this, but what I'm looking at is a large square area that's going to be developed that is currently very naturally laid out. And I was curious, in an instance when you're trying to replace with a buffer with good intention, I applaud the 1-to-1, that makes a lot of sense. Let's make sure that they're protected sufficiently, and it's really what I'm trying to go for. And so what I think I heard described is that they accounted for walkways already, and that's why the buffer is shrunk. Did I hear that, internalize that correctly?
I don't know if
At
that's
least
why the buffer
yeah.
is shrunk, but we tried to leave space to access in between the two buffer spaces.
Do we know, we don't necessarily know where the stormwater BMPs are gonna be placed on much of this site, correct?
Yeah, there will be development or district regional BMPs on the site. But yeah, each private parcel that develops is doing their own infrastructure.
So.
Will be a
No,
permitting.
There's a district stormwater system, so most of the parcels are on a regional system. Some of that system is what you see here. I mean, it does involve some of the ponds next to wetlands, some of the wetlands, but a lot of it is our linear VMPs that line the streets. You've seen that, the staff have seen that in some of the plan reviews that have gone forward. You'll see that in detail when we come forward with permits for the actual infrastructure construction. You're gonna see a lot of permit applications with this stuff, to be honest with you. You're gonna see dozens.
So at this stage, I guess where I was thinking is, as we looked at the previous figure, is there a lake, and we were talking boardwalks and access for people, is versus say a building or some other infrastructure. What's the likelihood that we might see a stormwater feature be put in that buffer?
That is, stormwater VMPs would be not in the buffer.
They're not going to be allowed.
Yeah, there's,
Yeah.
Sure of that?
there's
Well, it'd be a variance.
Yeah, it'd be a variance.
Well, that's not our plan.
Yeah.
I can tell you it's zero. Right, because we've gone to 60% plans out in the city of St. Paul. We're not gonna pull the rug out and start throwing BMPs and wetland buffers. There's no way.
And I have another question, just another one. What if we didn't approve the variance for the buffers? What would your plan be then?
Well, our plan or their plan?
Their plan.
When we come back to you, next board meeting, so we'd have to know why. Right, and.
Well, I'm just thinking like you would be then like, I'm just guessing you'd be like shrinking that one that you went over to try to somehow accommodate or something, but. In my mind, I'm just thinking it will just come back the same some other way.
Here's the deal, I mean, if we change the minimum, the amount of buffer area in total won't change.
Mhm.
Right, we'll just be not nipping and tucking here and there, and we can look at that. What Catherine was hinting at though is that we were trying to create in this particular location, a central area between the wetland mitigation, the remnant wetland, that people could experience these areas, really, that would be a place where people could actually enter. Right, see both. We can certainly pinch that in a little bit. You'd still have the same amount of buffer in total area. It's just that minimum then would be a little bit higher at south end. So that's doable. We can make that happen if that's where the direction from the board is.
You know, I would just advocate that I really like that they included that future access there. I mean, this is a multimodal, multi-use development where there's not going to be a ton of green space in the future, and having a maybe on like a site like this, I think is great that they're thinking that far in advance. So, and being that it's a constructed wetland, I would say, the minimum there, I'm okay with it, with all the reasoning behind it.
Right, and I'm gonna guess that it would come back less environmentally friendly if we didn't approve it, is I guess what I was thinking could happen.
I guess I'm comfortable with this from the standpoint that buffers already provide a few different things. They provide, I think we're probably used to thinking of them, or primarily thinking of them in terms of roughness coefficient for movement of whatever pollutants across the landscape into. There have been plenty of studies that have shown that you don't need a very wide buffer at all to achieve that.
Okay.
But you also may want buffers to do things like provide some wildlife habitat. And so in that thought, you want much wider, but when you think in terms of that whole averaging thing, what they're presenting at that location, you've got some places that are very wide. And from an average, it seems like it's almost an ideal situation because you are constrained in some locations. And those constraining places, are they going to be able to adequately meet kind of a water quality protection? And I think they will. I think that consideration will be built into the average of our rule. So even though they're slightly under and that minimum, they do have much wider than other places that are providing much more than just the water quality.
Yeah.
And we've historically made variances in this regard many times.
Mhm.
This isn't like the first time we've done this.
Yeah,
It's very depressing to me every single time, but we've done this a lot.
well, and it's the first time that they're creating it, and the ones that they're creating are making a variance. That's what kicks me.
That's-
And it's next to a road, which, and that's where the smallest buffer is, and so the filtration off the road is gonna be less than the filtration around. So the average doesn't really count there. And so that's in my head. I think it's probably the best it's gonna get, because what I'm gathering from the context and what's been said is they're not gonna move any of the other parcels. That's effectively what I'm hearing. And so I'm comfortable where it's at, as long as we don't start overly penetrating into it. It's my concern.
And I can certainly provide that feedback. We had a meeting about the wetland buffer variance, because I wanted to make sure it was clear what's being asked now.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't comfortable with something that might happen, that hasn't been designed, so. And certainly, you know, Bob's obviously here, so that feedback is helpful for as they think about future amenities.
We love our buffers, so.
Yeah.
All right, as depressing as it is, I'll move this one. I can't find the number, I'm too far down.
23/7,
I'll move 22, whatever you say.
23/7.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay,
Thanks, Catherine.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bob.
Okay.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much.
enforcement action reports.
Yeah.
You.
This is kind of just Mary and I's activities this month and meetings. Violations went down quite a bit. It has barely rained. I think that's part of it. There was a illicit discharge of turbid water from dewatering activities at an Oakdale site, and Mary followed the proper enforcement and got the problem fixed. So there's some pictures, but I'd be happy to answer questions. If there are any, I don't think Mary's on today.
There were report, love pictures.
Yeah, it's pretty,
That's how you can tell people get into management, so they're liking pictures.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the only way to burn information.
these pictures are helpful for contractors too, because if, you know, you have to get off site to get this picture, but it, you know, when they're kind of like, oh, who cares, we're just pumping water into a sewer, like it goes somewhere. So it's helpful to get that kind of follow-up, visual follow-up.
I have one very minor editorial. It's the caption or description with the picture of the outfall of the grate showing the turbid water.
Yeah.
And it reads that you had the NPCA duty officer called. It's actually the state duty officer.
The Minnesota duty officer.
Yeah, it's a Minnesota duty officer. It's not, PCA doesn't have a duty officer. It's duty officer can take calls from all sorts of ag issues or health violation, any sorts of things, not just something from PCA. Probably heard it from PCA, but I was always told it's somebody that sits in the basement of the Capitol 24/7 that answers his phone and
Talk to them.
yeah, and will contact emergency response people in the field to get the right people in play. So small editorial.
Yeah.
Any further questions on the enforcement report? And then Nicole, I think the rule changes. There seems like there definitely is action here.
Yep.
Did you want to walk through it, or? did you-
So this might be the first time many of almost all board members have been going through this. When we do a rules revision process, we do that in collaboration with our neighboring watershed districts, Capital Region. So we started this, it's been going in stops and starts since last year. We did an informal comment period on proposed rule changes from early February to early March. That was not required. That was just, we wanted to get some comments early. So we distributed that to a number of partners, all of our cities, counties, state agencies, private engineering industry, to get some informal comments. But I'll just kind of step through some rule change highlights. Or maybe I won't. I don't know. If you guys have questions.
Self-explanatory.
Yeah,
I'd rather jump to questions.
yeah, that's probably better.
What's the best way to convey any minor edits, suggestions?
To the rules or to the memo?
To the rules?
Okay, yes, so the board action that's being requested tonight is to authorize a formal public comment period that is required by statute, minimum 45 days, and we would do that. We should be doing that at the same time as Capital Region, I would think, although they have their own board meetings and their rules are, while very similar, there are some differences. So during that formal comment period, if the board authorizes to go out for that, you get sent these comments, and so you're asked to come. And you can, email me. We'll prepare a similar response to comments after the formal comment period, which you'll see again. Hopefully by doing the informal review and comment responses, we got some of them knocked off already. It's possible a lot of people are like, oh, well, I'll just wait till the second one. And so we might get a lot. But yeah, I'd love for you guys to send comments.
And it's available for 60 days in public comments, is that correct?
45 days.
So I mean, we're gonna meet again afterwards. Would you be comfortable, because I just have some clarifying questions on the rules, why was one removed versus or a bullet removed, et cetera.
Yeah.
It seems like it would be beneficial if we approve it to go public, write up our own comments, and then come back at the next board meeting. It seems that would be prudent, or at least what I would recommend, as opposed to discussing them all at length now, if you're comfortable with that.
Yeah, however you want to do it. If you would like to verbally discuss comments at a future meeting, I think we could do that June 28th after you've had some time to compile those. But they'll also be included in a public comment and response memo. Unless for some reason you didn't want them to be. I don't know if that's
I would say if they're like little editorial, like grammatical, little things that we can just change behind the scenes if they are substantial in meaning. If they're questions or clarifications, I would just go ahead and give Nicole a call or send her an email and she can help clarify those. If they're things that might be a potential change to the rule, then they would be included in the.
So that maybe if I frame it up in this way, did anybody see changes in the rules they question now for discussion that they're ready to have discussion on?
I didn't say anything substantial.
I didn't either. It seems more important to get it available for public comments, and then if there's any further ones, we can come back and address them in the future.
Yeah, and the board's not being asked to approve these rule changes, just to approve the comment period.
I move we approve the comment period for these rule changes.
I second that.
And authorize the distribution.
Yeah.
And that,
We jump right in.
Yeah, I went there. Where's any further discussion?
May I
Just-
just jump in on one thing? Sorry. Nicole,
Yeah.
I just want to clarify something with the timing to make sure. We do need to provide public notice. We need to publish public notice prior to the public hearing. So was that planned to be at the end of this month or after the review period has ended?
It was proposed to be at the next board meeting unless we don't have enough time. Then I can push it. What's
Okay.
the public notice?
It needs to be once a week for 2 consecutive weeks. And depending on when we have to get it in by for the newspaper to publish it in time, I'll look into it tomorrow and then
Okay.
let you know.
Yeah, I had a draft public hearing announcement that I was gonna send your way anyway for the website. And so we can talk about, what those requirements are. And then I was gonna touch base with Capital Region to see if we're gonna maintain that same schedule.
Okay, sounds good. We can talk about it more.
Okay.
So the only discussion that I wanted to say is, did you want the comments to go to you first or just straight to Nicole? Is that okay?
You can just-
Straight, to Nicole. Okay, so all in favor of authorizing the distribution of the enclosed revised rules for formal 45-day public review and comment period, say aye.
Aye.
And as part of that formal distribution, again, you will receive that directly and with instructions on how to comment. But yeah, as you can always just, the instruction will be to email me. Spoiler.
It seems like that's the important part. I can ask my questions later. Going forward to the stewardship grant program, I think that's big.
Yeah, that's me. I will take the hot seat from Nicole, I guess. Nice job, Nicole. So this one it's a shoreline restoration. It was pulled from the consent agenda only because it's a Ramsey County Parks and Rec project where, as you know, Ben works. I don't know that you worked on this design at all. So Lauren, I wasn't sure if it officially had to be pulled from the consent agenda or not, but I did just to be safe. So this is a shoreline restoration designed by Brian Olson at Ramsey County Parks and Rec, who does all of our design work for Ramsey County stewardship grant projects. So this would be a project led by the Parks and Rec department. They would hire a contractor to do the work out here. Completing this, I think it's about 3,700 square feet of short native plants going in on Beaver Lake. So nothing out of the ordinary. They have a separate $20,000 grant that they're putting towards the project and then are requesting that $42,315 from us.
This makes me happy. I move approval of application 23-19 CS.
I'll second.
Discussion?
Can I just get clarification, Lauren? It's okay that I vote on this issue?
Yeah, so it doesn't sound like you've been involved with this one, is that?
I have not been involved in design or anything on this one. I know of its existence probably more intimately than some people, but I've not worked on it myself.
Okay, I think it's okay to go ahead and vote.
Thank you.
Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Problems with that one. Okay. Budget status updates. A lot of money movement.
A lot of movement this month, yes. Yeah, so a lot of projects that you approved tonight. And then we will talk about the enhanced street sweeping grants next. I do want to confirm that I did approve, the board, was it in April, conditionally approved that Battle Creek Middle School project. So they have submitted their final plans and calculations. They're meeting, well, exceeding what was originally approved for phosphorus removal. And yeah, stayed within that, budget that we had approved. So I did approve them for that additional 30,000 that was requested at the April meeting. Yeah, any other questions about projects?
No, thank you for the update on that one. I was going to ask. Any other questions for Paige? Board action items, and thank you, Paige. On to the next thing. I think it's you for the enhanced street sweeping.
Yeah, so I wasn't planning to do a big background into our study. Ben and Mark, I know you weren't here when we talked about it, but in the packet, that street sweeping prioritization study link was included, as well as a link to the board meeting where we discussed it. So hopefully you had a chance to watch that. If not, we can definitely answer questions as we go through. But basically after reviewing the study and presenting that to the board, with the recommendation of that baseline street sweeping of 1 spring sweeping, 1 summer sweeping, and 2 to 3 fall sweepings, the board approved allocating $128,000 in carryover funds from the stewardship grant program, allocating that specifically towards enhanced street sweeping grants for 2023. Our goal was to have these to the cities in the fall So we're kind of ahead of schedule just based on some of the meetings we had. Obviously, it's more beneficial to the cities to know earlier in the year if they will be awarded this funding. So you'll see those requests below. We did have individual meetings with several of our cities. Everyone was given that opportunity, I guess, except Gem Lake. They're just a little bit too small. So we focus on some of the larger areas. Did hold those one-on-one meetings where we were able to confirm some of the survey data that they all submitted for the study that we completed. And then you'll see the requests. Some cities just, they're maybe meeting or exceeding that baseline, but they were still given the opportunity to ask us for funding. Some did not express interest at this time. They, for whatever reasons, they're, fine doing what they're, they have their funding allocated for this year, or they just don't have the capability to take that on at this time. A lot of them expressed interest in funding for equipment purchases, which $128,000 is not enough for that. So we said we would take that into consideration for 2024 funding or future funding when we, if we can allocate for that in the future. What else? So City of Woodbury has the most significant request. You can see they actually came forward last year because they had completed a study of their own in an effort to enhance their own street sweeping. They previously have just been doing one spring sweeping and one fall sweeping. So they really want to enhance that. So they're looking at doing monthly sweepings in the South Washington portion. So they've started that. We're a little bit behind schedule from what South Washington has approved. So they've just done their standard sweepings in our area so far. So pending approval tonight, they would start that monthly sweeping either end of this month or early July in our part of the district. And then they would match up with the South Washington portion. We still get significant benefit. We reviewed that with BAR. We would never tell someone not to sweep more. So we're still getting a lot of fluid removal, a lot of sediment removal, with those additional sweepings. So that's great to see that they've made that request. And then the other cities are looking at, Landfall, Little Canada, Oakdale, look at hiring contractors to do an additional 1 to 2 sweepings in the fall. And then City of White Bear Lake, they felt they didn't have the capacity to take this on this year, but as you can see, they ranked pretty high in an area where we want to increase recovery of pollutants. So we looked at kind of specifically 2 priority areas of White Bear Lake. I think it's about, I don't have that in front of me, but about 100 acres of drainage into Willow Creek and Willow Lake. So we would look at working with a contractor to hire that out. It would help us to determine if that's something we can do in the future. I've never dealt with a street sweeping contractor, so it'll be a good learning experience to see what goes into that. White Bear Lake was very open to working with us if there's anything we need from them as far as finding disposal areas or outreach to their residents about the additional sweeping. They're happy to help with that. So I think with that, I'll turn it back to you, Val, for any questions, comments.
Yeah, could you help? Okay, so the 2023 on White Bear Lake contract option, and we're allocating money for it. So that means that they're hitting a couple targeted areas is what I think I heard. Is that right, Paige?
That's what we would look at for this. The other cities, we're looking at the full city within our district, just because that dollar amount fit that. And the 29,000 that's requested for White Bear Lake, that was the remaining dollar amount after I took out what was allocated for the other cities or recommended for the other cities. So I don't know where we'll come in with that, probably under that.
And just to be clear, so that White Bear Lake portion, we would contract that and manage that contract. Part of the pilot, a different arm of the pilot to see what it would be like for us to manage street sweeping contract. And if that would be something we could do in other areas.
When the Woodbury, the amount was surprising because they got 30K, I think, last time.
So they were awarded.
We gave them something.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Paige. I'm sorry.
Okay, I think the board approved 50,000 last year. They but they only spent, I can't remember, it was either 17,000, I think it was about 17,000 was what they ended up using. So
That
yeah, it
helps.
is significant, but they have the 6 sweepings.
6 sweepings in a larger area.
I think this is one of the most cost-effective BMPs around, so I don't have any other questions.
You know,
Couple of questions, in your meetings with the cities on the page, do you have a sense, how many of the cities have their own equipment? How many are working with contractors? Is there any kind of collaboration across cities that have their own equipment? You know, what kinds of avenues might there be for the district thinking into the future, you know, promoting this? What's the best avenue? Is it just money? Or is there some way we get more equipment out there? Is that constrained or what?
yeah,
We
so
know-
most cities, I think all cities except landfall have their own equipment, but then they also will contract out some of the sweeping. Landfall strictly contracts out, and I'd have to, we have all those answers, so I can verify, Mark, exactly what, you know, we know what type of sweepers they have. Most of them are on I think it was a 10 to 12 year cycle where they can, you know, keep them operating for that long, but then they need to be replaced. Most of them, you know, they might have the equipment, but they might not have operators for that equipment. Some discussion happened around sharing the equipment, but they all need it at the same time. So that wasn't really an option. But I feel like there's another part to your question that I'm missing.
We won't have all that data. And that's
So-
was to try
To allocate the funding.
to get the funding. It seemed like from the city that this, many of them would be contributing because of additional.
Sorry, Tina, I couldn't hear you very well.
Sorry, I was saying that it seemed like the cities that were interested, they were contracting out the sweeping because they didn't have either the capacity or the people to complete additional.
Yeah, exactly.
So if we have all that data, has that been kind of organized and, you know, is it available? Is it something you're still working with? Is that
That
something-
compiled in the report.
Yeah, I think most of that should be in that report, Mark, from
Okay.
last
Yeah.
December. Yeah.
The link in
It was a fairly thorough report. I thought it was a good read. Had a lot of great data in it.
Yeah.
I did have a question on landfall now that you brought that up, Paige. If landfall ended up needing, so because they're planning to contract out, if landfall needed additional money, would we pull that from the White Bear Lake potential money?
Sure. Yep. I think if the board is comfortable with that, you know, I don't know how exactly, I have to look at my wording here. But yeah, I think we could pull, I mean, maybe for any of the cities if they needed additional. Most of these, I would say the cities tried to estimate high. They didn't get specific estimates at this point, but I think most of them should be okay. But I think we definitely have that capability to pull from the White Bear Lake area if needed.
We could also come back and ask you for funds out of the stewardship grant program.
That was my next question. Okay.
Yeah.
And then subsequently, if these cities choose to come back and ask, you can both bring it back.
I move approval of 2023 enhanced sweeping grant requests and direct staff to coordinate a street sweeping contract for areas in White Bear Lake.
I actually had a question on the page.
So
If I may.
let's second it and then we can.
Okay.
do this.
Okay, second.
Discussion.
Yeah, no, mine just goes back to like some of these cities that didn't express interest. And is that explained in the street sweeping prioritization study, or is that something you can share with us in more detail? And then I'm especially interested in this contract option and how that might be leveraged for some of these cities who aren't interested in this cost share at this time with enhanced sweeping. I guess a third thing is like, I don't know if it's in that study again, but did we do some type of traffic study to see, you know, in these cities where they're not interested, if we really wanted to maximize funds that we may have in the future, these are streets that see increased sedimentization due to, increased traffic flows or things like that, where we could say, if we wanted to help out St. Paul or Shoreview, here's areas where we might prioritize even within those cities.
Yes, okay, I think I got all that. So as far as the individual meeting results, the study came out prior to our individual meetings, so those notes are not in there. I guess, we have notes from our individual meetings, but then, most of them, like for Roseville specifically, I mentioned in this memo, they were interested in collaborating with Capital Region Watershed Districts, just to make sure that they get all the priority areas of their city, not just, the Ramsey-Washington portion. So that was why at this time they wanted to wait. Maplewood, Shoreview, I think they have a pretty hearty sweeping program at this point. North St. Paul, I might have to look back, but I think they also actually are exceeding our recommendation for baseline sweeping, and they, have what they need at this point. Some people express interest maybe in helping with finding disposal sites, things like that. I think looking at the contractor option, I think this was your next question, that will help some of these areas that maybe don't have capacity to add on or coordinate that at any given time. It does, it would be an extra effort for staff to take on, so we can see what that would look like. And then as part of our study, Bar looked at each city, and we have pretty detailed what we call priority areas within each city. So we would look at, okay, this, and that takes in a lot of the things you asked about, Ben. So looking at, I don't know necessarily traffic areas, but tree cover and other things around it, what water body it drains to. We factor all that in. Existing BMPs, ponds that are in the area. So factors that in, so we could rank that. And then, if we wanted to in the future, hire a contractor, especially in those cities that aren't doing anything additional, we could look at doing that.
So we didn't look at traffic,
Okay.
but we did look at pretty substantially look at tree cover for leaf, potential for leaf fall.
Okay, so all in favor of any other further discussion? So all in favor of approval, say aye.
Aye.
So let's go, Lauren, attorney reports, falls to you.
Hello, I don't have anything to report to you all tonight, which is a good thing.
I like that.
That's perfect. And now board discussion topic. This was, so you had brought up something on one of the permits on that land in Maplewood. Are there, what we used to discuss in boards, as you guys walk around, you see things, question, could you just bring them up? This is the good time to do it. That was a perfect time for the permit. It's very relevant. But if you guys have other things that, well, let us know during the discussion. Anything worth talking about now tonight? I don't have anything either at this point because we're going to talk actions there, but go ahead, Mark.
So he texted me about a tour or whatever, I was able to make that. Do we have tours kind of, where are we at with that?
Yeah.
Thinking.
Yeah, so we fit them in before the board meetings, typically in the growing season time frame. Especially when there's something applicable maybe going on at the time. So in this case, the Coleman Basin was just wrapping up. It was a good opportunity to see it with low water levels. So if there's a construction project happening that we can get you on site and kind of see it in progress, that's based on timing, right? So, but typically, yes, we would plan something ahead of the board meetings through this growing season.
Do you think there's an opportunity for the 28th? Is that right? Did I get that every, the next one, 28th?
Potentially, maybe Arbogast, I don't know, Paige, if that's,
Yeah, potentially. I don't know if, Aaron, we have a start date quite yet, but could be.
I think finding another, I like, especially during this beautiful period, it's
Yeah.
really awesome to see. We only started those back up in the last year or two, right? So it's not, I haven't seen much of it, frankly.
Right, and just kind of sprinkle them in. If there's anything in particular that you're like, I really want to see this, let me know so I can plan that.
Beforehand, we had done like a joint, like we had talked to doing a bunch of site tour,
Yeah.
maybe asynchronous to the board.
Yeah.
We had
like
discussed that prior.
We typically would do that in September,
Yeah, so in the fall.
and we would do a CAC and we would invite the CAC and the board and staff. And that would be we rent a bus. This time we would rent a bus. Last time we just did it. My minivan.
Yes, as
We could rent a bus and plan a whole.
and
Tooling around.
and there was, I know this came up in the action item, so I want to make sure that we spend some time talking about it. I like that the CAC is coming periodically. I know during when Paige was here, we had talked about having them come forward for additional ideas, not just adopt drain. So as long as we keep that on, and I can work with you to clarify that action, to say, hey, it's adopt drain plus maybe some other ideas from CAC. That would be the next only other thing to add or talk about.
You're saying in the.
In like our action log today, we
Yeah.
have like, look at CAC and publicizing the adopt drain and how that's
Yeah.
going and things like that.
Yeah.
I think the last conversation we had, I think Stephanie was here, I believe she was here, and she had talked around like, hey, there's a bunch of ideas that we have. It was in the packet. I think it'd be nice to have a discussion on it in the future. Yep. That's the only other thing that I wanted to bring up and just reiterate. Any other discussion topics? Okay, new reports and presentations. This one was a nice short one. Review of equity area definition.
Yeah, and I have a brief presentation just meant to walk you through the memo essentially.
Here.
Nothing fancy, but wanted to, just walk you through this memo.
Can I just verify, Paige, are you seeing the equity data set evaluation? Yes, thank you.
Oh, and I say June 6th board meeting. It is not the 6th, it is the 7th, just to clarify. Okay, next slide.
Oops, sorry.
No problem. So as you saw in the memo, we looked at 3 different equity data sets. And why are we looking at this at all? Maybe I should back up and start with that. So one of the ways that the watershed district determines its priority areas, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to look at this. One is where are the impaired water bodies. Another way is to look at where are there areas where we may not have worked as often as others. And those often tend to be in areas with folks who maybe they're less vocal, maybe they've got bigger concerns going on, they're not going to be squeaky wheels. There's a lot of reasons that some areas might get overlooked. And so for areas that aren't in an impaired watershed, there might still be reasons for outreach, for involvement, for engagement, for education that still makes sense for the watershed district to prioritize the projects. So there's a number of ways that we can look at how to find those areas. There's a lot of different data sets that try to get at this because in this day and age, there's a lot of folks trying to use an equity lens to help prioritize their projects. So we looked at 3 different data sets, one of which we're already using. So, and that's the 3rd bullet here. You see the asterisk there because, oops, yeah, you're controlling.
Sorry,
Okay.
here you.
Or did you just pass it to me?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'll be up there.
Okay, wait, how do I advance right here? Thanks, folks, for your patience. Okay, yeah, the one that we use now is something that came from the Metropolitan Council. It's the place-based equity concepts of areas of concentrated poverty, which we refer to as the ACP, or in the case of Ramsey-Washington, in addition to areas of concentrated poverty with 50% or more minority population, ACP 50. So that's what we've been using for years. At the time when that came out with the Met Council, it was kind of a new concept, and a lot of folks thought this is a great surrogate for looking at areas we should be focusing, areas maybe we might overlook. We looked at 2 other data sets though, because there's some new ways of thinking about this and people are looking at it in different ways. So one is the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index, the SVI, and then one is closer to home here, Ramsey County's Community Climate Vulnerability Assessment. So it's a CCVA vulnerability index. And Ben, I don't know if you're familiar.
I've seen it, I've not used
Yeah.
it on any of our projects.
Yeah, so this is countywide way to look at climate change vulnerability and to assess an index to help figure out across the county where there are areas that people are particularly vulnerable in the context of climate change threat. Okay, so I'm just going to walk you through these three briefly. So this is the Ramsey County climate change vulnerability assessment. And I put up a couple excerpts here, not because we're going to read them together, but just to kind of give you a taste of this. So this is really about climate change and vulnerability. And this was an exercise that Ramsey County did as part of their 2014-2018 strategic plan. So they looked at across the county, what are the main climate threats that they perceive to be most impactful, and who are the people and where are the people who might be most vulnerable to those threats. And so they went through a whole exercise. This is similar to something that other counties and other entities have done. South Washington Watershed District has done something like that. You all actually look at certain things like this in a slightly different way, but it's still relevant. So we'll talk through that in a minute. So anyway, the assessment focused on 6 topics related to climate change and vulnerability throughout Ramsey County. So extreme heat events, poor air quality, changes in precipitation, changing ecologies, but also the social pieces, changing demographics and psychological impacts. And so you can see down here on the bottom, to further clarify what we mean by changing demographics and psychological impacts, we're talking about aging populations, immigrants and refugee populations coming in. And so some big changes coming for Ramsey County in terms of demographics. And then psychological impacts, here's where we're talking about mental health issues that can come about, including anxiety, stress, depression, PTSD, and people that are particularly vulnerable to these things would be older adults, children. I'm not sure why it says women, but we'll just say, it does say women, people with disabilities or poor physical and mental health, those with minimal education, and people in poverty, immigrants and refugees. And some of that is because of also language barrier, because it can be difficult to get communication to folks about what's going on and what can be done. So take some of those with a grain of salt, but this is the lens through which Ramsey County was looking at this.
They listed a whole gender.
I know, I don't know where that's coming from. But anyway, they looked most specifically at these societal factors. And so I thought I would just list them for you here. And so this is getting at things like who's living under the poverty threshold, who has lesser education, age, people living in crowded housing. We mentioned the language barrier, people who don't have a car, people who live in mobile homes, and people who work outside. I mean, that's a practical metric, right? In terms of climate change and heat stress. And then land use, where are people living versus where are businesses or schools or other types of land use versus parks, for example. So that's the Ramsey County CCVA index. Some of the pros and cons, okay? So the pros, it's locally tailored. Most of your watershed district is in Ramsey County. It's designed to address vulnerability specific to that county, considering local factors and characteristics. It does have a climate change focus, which for a watershed district, I think is a pro. It emphasizes the impacts of climate change, which can assist in developing targeted adaptation measures that are within your purview and the things that you do day to day. Cons, so limited applicability. We don't have Washington County covered here. There's a cut off at the border. We do suffer from some lack of standardized metrics. So it's a localized index. So comparisons with other areas of the country might be challenging, and there might be reasons that that could be a useful thing to do. Spatial resolution, again, it's sort of related to the bullet above, but it's likely it is available at the county level, Ramsey County, and then smaller communities, depending on the level of detail in the assessment. So depending on the level of detail in each of the layers that they looked at, you may be able to look at a smaller area.
Aaron, can I ask a quick question on climate
Yeah.
change focus?
Yeah.
Do we integrate a different metric for that elsewhere?
So you mean?
So I'm thinking right now there's a bunch of criteria that help us understand how climate change might impact that particular population.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I had gathered from the read. Is unique. It seemed unique, at least compared to the one being recommended.
Yeah.
And so are there other ways that we include climate change
Yeah.
in discussions for these types of targeted areas.
Right, so yes, I mean, that's one thing I think is important to think about. And by the way, we're not deciding on one tonight, we're just talking through them, but one thing that I struggle with a little bit with Ramsey County, on one hand, I like that climate change is part of it, but there are other ways that Ramsey-Washington is looking at that in terms of flood risk. We have all sorts of ways to look at flood risk and how we rank those areas. We look at, areas, we look at, shorelines, wetlands, we look at all the sorts of other metrics that are a little more actionable for Ramsey-Washington. So, I struggle a little bit with, there's a lot of things I like about Ramsey County's index, but there's a little bit of overlap, a little bit of redundancy, and a little bit of, it's such a larger scale that I'm not sure that some of the ways they're looking at some of the threats that you would be worried about are drilled down fine enough detail for your purposes.
That's what I was looking for.
Yeah, so, yeah.
How long has it, I think you mentioned like 2014, 15 has it been in place and actively been used in some of Ramsey County programs for how long? Is it like just the first cycle or second cycle?
That's a good question. When I was looking at this earlier, it seemed like it was published and it has been used, but it hasn't been updated, which is another drawback, I think. Now, conceivably, they're going to update it. I don't know why they wouldn't. They have a nice data set in place. But it's not like you'll see with the CDCs, that's every 2 years. And granted, there's a big change whenever there's a census. So that's a downside in my mind. Now, I'm sure that they will update it at regular intervals.
So one of the ways we became aware of this was when Ramsey County did their reuse study, they considered these factors, correct?
Yeah.
So it is being used, I guess.
Yep, and that was 2-3 years ago. So yeah, it's actively being used. Yeah, and this kind of tipped off our reevaluation, like, well, wait a second, this looks pretty robust compared to what we've been using. It's time to look at these things again. So that's why we're here again. So any other questions on Ramsey County's? Okay. So the CDC index is, it's just a social index, and they're looking at folks, like how to decide, how to look at areas that might be particularly vulnerable, not just to climate change, but other things like diseases, extreme weather events, which may or may not be related to climate change. So they have these 16 social factors, and a lot of these they're similar, okay, to Ramsey County, a little bit different here and there, but similar, I think. And they're focused only on, again, the social piece. So they're not trying to layer in flood risk or heat stress, but they are thinking about where are people that might be vulnerable to those things. And this one is updated every 2 years. Okay, so pros, it's comprehensive in that it looks also at various social factors that influence vulnerability. It's widely recognized. So this is a national tool, well established, used by many people. This is very well known index. So it's consistent. If you were to compare your own metrics against another part of the country, that would be appropriate. And the resolution is nice because it's available at all different geographic scales. So you can look at census tract scale, county, state, and smaller. So the con is what we've been talking about. So the SVI provides an overview of vulnerability, but doesn't capture specific vulnerabilities involved with climate change.
Are there any publications that directly link this vulnerable population to people who are just going to be more impacted by climate change? Out of curiosity.
Can you say that again?
Yeah, so I'm jumping to conclusions in my head, but vulnerable populations, I would assume, would be equally vulnerable to climate change, like would be disproportionately vulnerable to climate change. So whether or not, like, this is a good con, I just feel like if it's more accurate in identifying those populations, we would, there's a correlation. My point.
There's a correlation, and that's why people do use this index for purposes of estimating climate change vulnerability as well. It's not as directly linked, but it's analogous.
You had me at standard measures on this one. Just
well, I saw your eye really hard speaking your language, but yeah, so it's kind of a nice one.
Yeah.
Any questions about this one? Okay. So this is the one we use now, the ACP and the ACP 50. And I didn't put pros and cons up here at all, and we're not gonna spend a lot of time on it because the Met Council doesn't even think we should use this anymore. So this publication, if you Google this document, actually it's very interesting because they did a deep dive on their use of their development and their use of this metric. And they decided that it's not appropriate because it makes the assumption that areas that have concentrated poverty, it makes a big assumption that they are vulnerable regardless of who they are, what their situation is, and all these other metrics that these other equity indices are looking at. So this is a really interesting read, actually, and I think it really demonstrates how our wisdom around equity and how to look at it and how to work with it has really evolved. So it's a great document to look at, but it's all we'll talk about because we're not recommending that we stay with ACP and ACP 50 because the Met Council doesn't even use it anymore. So any questions on that? They do a lovely job of like stating why they got all sorts of input, stating why they understand that it's not appropriate anymore and suggesting next steps, which is really great.
A broad question.
Yeah.
For all three of these, though, for the two more local, Met Council and the Ramsey County.
Yeah.
And a lot of these metrics seem to be introduced across several of them can change very dramatically.
Yeah.
In short periods of time.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious what their base of data
Mm-hmm.
is. Is it primarily the census data? You know, that's not very frequent.
Yeah.
And I'm curious
Yeah.
if those local indices have efforts to collect the data
Right.
on a more regular basis, as well as maybe revising.
Right. So one of the things I tried to chase down before tonight and didn't get an answer in time is how the CDC SVI, they update it every 2 years.
Yeah.
And I'm not exactly sure how that worked because as we know, the census is updated every 10. I did get.
Based off of voting cycle?
Maybe,
voting
and
every 2 years?
I did have a colleague, I'll look it up in a little bit, message me about this. He did find a blurb on their website that talked about how they're doing it. They are bringing additional data in. I'm not exactly sure where they're getting it. And Ramsey County, to create their initial data set, they were using census data. They haven't updated it yet. They'll be sitting with the same problem. So I don't know if it's on a 10-year cycle or what the plan is there. So, but I will follow up to let you know how the CDC, like what is it that's changing? How frequently would we get changes? Because demographics are changing all the time. So I did want to put this up. So this is showing a range of index points across Ramsey-Washington for each of these three indices. So the first one is the CDC SVI. And I know this is a lot of data to take in at once, but what you can see is colors that are like bluer are the high vulnerability numbers. And then down in the warmer colors, down to yellow, orange, those are the low colors. And then it's the same legend in the Ramsey County Community Climate Vulnerability Index. So high is blue, and you go through purple, red, down through orange and yellow to get to the low.
They must have a different sampling mechanism, looking at the differences in colors. I know that one's older than the other, but I know some of those areas haven't changed that dramatically.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so remember, Ramsey County is also layering in some other pieces relative to climate change that CDC wouldn't be doing. So they do look a little different. Some of the areas are the same. I mean, you can see, what is that, Pig's Eye?
Oh, yeah, thanks.
I mean, no one lives there, so that's why that's orange, very invulnerable. And some of the areas, but right next to it, there's a vulnerable slice that remains the same. But then if you look up into like the Grass Lake, Snail Lake area, that's pretty different. And even over a little further east, red in one spot, blue in another. So there are other layers that Ramsey County is factoring in that the CDC one isn't. So I think that points to the importance of thinking carefully about what Ramsey-Washington specific pieces are important to fold in versus elements that are already folded in through our decision-making process through the other ways we track flooding and other parts of vulnerable spots.
Is there anything that prevents you from using more than one index?
No, I mean, as long as they're not redundant, if they're complementary.
That's what I was curious about.
Yeah, these two have CDC and Ramsey County have a lot of overlap. And I guess just to round out the discussion and then we can open up for questions, you can see on the right, the ACP and ACP 50, just much more limited data set. It's kind of brute force binary kind of thing. Again, though, you see, that you see that one that was blue right next to Pig's Eye on CDC Ramsey County, and it's purple, the third one. That's probably because that's an area of, it's an area of concentrated poverty. And so that did register on the two other indices. So any questions? Again, you don't have to decide anything. Just wanted to walk you through the things we've been mucking through and see if you had any questions or
We'll have a decision in
requests.
December. Right?
And
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, just as a reminder of how we would use this data. One way is through our stewardship grant program, and so there is a specific 100% funding for homeowner projects that are within one of our equity areas.
Brilliant.
So that's
Mhm.
important. We also would use it as we're evaluating our own retrofit projects, so the targeted retrofit. One of the factors that we do our prioritization projects, the ranking. And then also other program areas like from the financial resources program, they use it to determine where they might have some areas of natural.
I think Paige's outreach in some of these areas is great.
Yeah. Yeah, sure.
I just think it's awesome that you're looking at that.
I have a question kind of follow what Val was maybe getting at, in that I'm guessing these are all geographic information data sets where we can go in and manipulate. Is there anything stopping us from stealing pieces of the climate
Right.
change and adding it to the CEC?
Yep.
And, or what that bar is done for our own, and having reasoning, like CDC for these reasons, but we're gonna take the climate change, maybe we take some information other people have gathered, some information we've done ourselves to really, make this
Fill it out.
what we need.
Make our own data.
I think Ben kind of hit on the head. It's like if there's anything pulling over that climate change, it'd be really interesting.
Yeah.
Exercise just to get to.
Yeah. Well, and we kind of do that in one sense. I don't think it's quite as robust as what we're discussing, but if you remember in our prioritization tool, where we're looking at water quality project, we look at vulnerable areas as we've defined them in the past. We would change how we define them. But we also look at areas of flood risk. We look at areas of, where there's habitat creation. We do look at some other things that are starting to get at climate change, resilience benefits. So it'll be interesting to kind of tease out, how do we fold that in a consistent way across the various decisions that we're making.
I was just going to further suggest it'd be interesting because if a standard index, you should be able to tease out, as Ben's highlighted, just to make us feel confident that we are doing the climate change impact as much as we can.
Agreed.
And then my other question is gonna be, finding areas that need equitable access to these programs due to climate change may be easy. But is there any fear of falling into that same Met Council trap without gathering more information from the applicant when you're saying we're also looking at income levels, race? Are you gonna start collecting that with your applications? How would that piece fold into the actual implementation of giving those funds?
Just spot check with
Because,
that.
I could live in an area that might not cover.
I was just thinking about that, some of the top areas, there's little pockets.
Or even making the criteria for free if you're below this income or these criteria gets you into that rebid.
Yeah,
That's a good idea.
Yeah, well, how do
That's a good
you
idea.
figure that out as well? It's a bigger issue than just, they live here on.
Yeah, that's a good point. Right? How do you find the people that would fit that criteria in one of the yellow zones?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that too.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Another factor this is all very social based, which I think is very appropriate. We're thinking about climate change in terms of some of the flooding and other impacts. There's clearly kind of the topographic, physical type attributes as well that I think that could be added on and in a different kind of index fashion, so that it becomes kind of, as you guys were suggesting, our own sort of hybrid. I guess the other thing is, as I'm looking at these, just the eyeball test. And not that we're gonna probably just glom on to any one of these, but the CDC Social Vulnerability Index just seems like it has the right kind of gradations. And the Ramsey County one, I'm looking at this and I see North St. Paul just sort of you can see the city. It just sort of sits there. Not that the shade should be any different, but it's almost like, why did that block get, pulled out and isolated in a very different fashion than the surrounding area? I mean, to me, my eyes kind of just catches that and says, trust that. Whereas the other one just sort of seems like it's a gradient that kind of makes sense. Not that it's accurate.
Sure.
So,
Well, and we
it's an
could,
observation.
yeah, and where we see things like that, we could be, I mean, this is all data, all the information is behind the layers here. So we could find out, if there's areas that stand out, why in one index would it not in another?
It'd be nice just to touch base again before we make the decisions on the budget in December, right? Because that's what this is going to influence. Is it possible to come back just again in the fall?
Yeah,
Just
for sure. And this doesn't have to be approved
Yeah.
with the stewardship grant. I mean, we can talk about it at a different time. Stewardship grant will approvals will establish the 100% and the metric that we're using to determine where we would give those funds at 100%.
It'd be nice to just be part of the learning journey. And I mean, I don't have any further questions. I don't forgive me, but just
It
this
is a
is
learning
important.
journey.
I was just gonna think it would also be nice to see some statements or how you balance the social aspects from the climate resiliency aspects and how you would rank a project. Maybe one's got great social, but there's not much climate change. Maybe there's one that's got great climate resiliency, but there's not a huge social impact. And how where the watershed district is trying to direct most of these grants, that would be 100%, because it's hard to overlap those without looking at individual pieces of an analysis, in my mind.
Yeah, I think so. One of the reasons we went to this more standardized approach was because we weren't going to ask people to provide their income levels,
Sure.
to determine. So we wanted to find a way to provide that without having to require that people to have to set the income needs and funds. But I think it would be helpful when we come back the next time to talk about our prioritization tool again. Kind of overview that and digest that.
Yeah.
That might help understand how we balance all those.
Seems like it'd be good to do as part of the budget planning cycle. Right, because don't we use the prioritization tool for the CIP? Or am I remembering that correctly? We can do it later. That's fine.
Yeah, so the budgeting process will say, here's how much money we were asking for targeted retrofit.
It's picking the project.
Grants.
Yeah.
Were you thinking of the inspection tool?
Yes. Oh, forgive me. You're right. I was thinking the wrong tool, Tina.
Yeah.
That one does impact the CAP, but the water quality,
My bad. My
No.
mistake.
the water tool. So, okay. Yeah, happy to come back and talk about that.
Any further questions for Erin? This is awesome.
Yeah, thank
love
you.
this.
You're welcome. It's great. You guys do good work.
Good. Administration report. After you, Tina.
Yes. Sure.
Phenomenal job on Water Fest. I know I said that informally, but I wanted to put it on record.
Yeah, it's certainly feedback. That speed, but it was a great day, very hot, but I would say well attended and really good feedback that we've heard. So we'll have more information, I'm sure. But I thought if there was just a placeholder thing, they make any comments, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, my kids loved writing the street sweeper.
Yeah.
And then they liked, my daughter my son thought it was hilarious that he left Paige with a puzzle box. Totally ripped apart.
I did not put it back together.
Did they recognize the street sweeper, or was it a phenomenal DMP?
I said it, but they go for it. The good stuff.
One of the features of Waterfest is we have a passport program, so there's a number of stops throughout the event where kids can go and learn something, get their passport stamped.
My kids are goal oriented. So
Yeah, it's a good goal. I think that's a very well attended part of the event for sure. And people liked getting on the water, I think.
Thanks for sharing that. I felt bad, but this is the first one I've met
Yeah.
from the beginning.
Oh, that's impressive. Yeah, it's what I was gonna say. I don't know if I've seen the water festival.
you can lift the carrots with me, Mark. I'll just a picture.
There's a little update in here about the budgeting process, to give you an idea of kind of what this looks like. Next month, you'll hear, it'll be real high level and kind of like, these are the things that we're looking at, here's what you'll be expecting. August will be much more detailed, and you'll see the first draft of the budget table, including descriptions for each of the line items. September is when the public hearing and preliminary approval is given. So there's more of a presentation and more opportunity for the public to comment. And then not till December do we do the final budget review. And staffing updates, you met some of them on there as far as our natural resources program. We've hired Pat Williamson, who starts on Monday, so we're pretty excited to have Pat back. He was an intern for a couple of years with us and will be returning. And then I do have an offer out to the program manager. I can't say any names at this point, but I'm guessing I will hear for sure tomorrow. So I can share that with you when I have the word.
May we have some sort of welcome party at all? Maybe that replaces the board tour, just to say hi.
Yeah,
welcome.
that's a good idea. Actually, we could do a little
Be nice to say.
meet and greet. Yeah,
Bill was so impactful, and
Yeah.
Pat's going to be impactful, and the interns are already being impactful.
yeah, for sure. That's a great idea. Look at that. I have the action log in here. I apologize. I had intended to include the governance manual in this packet and did not make it in. That was an oversight. So you will see that next month, as well as I think the adopted dream for sure, program evaluation promotion information will be in there. That was a big part of the CAC, as we talked about. The CAC is excited about that, and they did some work on that at Waterfest, trying to get people to sign up. So I think I'll have some ideas from them as far as what's next for that program, as well as some overview of that went at Waterfest.
I just have one question on the West Vadnais Lake boundary.
Yeah.
We just keep pushing that along.
Yeah.
Is there any reason for that?
It's both my time and the Bowser staff turnover changed, as I mentioned before. So our board conservationist is new to the boundary change process. They've been understaffed there. So, and I mean, to be honest, and I know this was a concern at the beginning of the year too, but as far as changeover, so now Jesse Farrell is no longer the city engineer and public works director at Vadnais Heights. So I do have some more work to do on that. To be honest, I mean, it's certainly something that I'm still working on, we're doing, but it doesn't necessarily impact our programming.
It's just be nice to have before budgeting discussions finish, you know what I mean? Because
Yeah.
it needs a lot of help.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we can talk about that during the budget discussions, because we'll look at priorities across the district and whether or not it really does change the impact of that. And I can also give an update too, when we go through that, about what formal has been doing or
Mhm.
has, you know, over the last year, so. We'll get.
I don't have any further questions. Do y'all?
And just a reminder again, June 28th is our next meeting, so just a couple of weeks away. So I know Pam is not able to attend. Is everybody else able to? Just to make sure I have a quorum.
I have a question mark.
Okay.
I'm supposed to be in the field that week. I'm hoping that I can arrange it that I'm back that Wednesday mid-afternoon. So I will know probably within a week, 2 weeks for certain, and I can let you know.
Thanks.
Should be a quick meeting because we only got like 2 weeks of stuff to
I
cover.
know. Yeah.
No, I think you just cursed us there.
Yeah.
Dan. Pretty good.
I didn't get like 300, so.
They're coming tomorrow.
Yeah. Over.
Awesome. So if there's no further questions, any questions on projects and program status? I personally didn't have any, so it's out of curiosity.
Thanks to Joe for doing the natural resources update.
I
Lauren.
was going to ask because I saw Bill's name still throughout, or no, sorry, during the project updates.
Oh, we do.
Yeah.
We can't let him go.
Okay.
You're right,
I was curious who wrote it. I was like, did Bill just do a favor here? I just didn't know.
Natural resources update. On planting. Lauren Hazelton has returned. She's our communications coordinator, but she had just returned right before Waterfest. Thankfully, so work on that, but she'll have it reported next. So.
Cool. Okay. Manager comments next month's meeting. I think it's in 2 weeks. I think we just covered what's in next month's meeting. I don't have any further comments. We kind of hit them off pretty quick there during the meeting. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
I believe that's it.
Great.
Thank you very much.